On Dialogues with Creators, we try to have a variety of guests and a variety of topics as we explore the nature of creativity and what creative people do. Today, we're having a first, someone who is called a naturalist, and we're going to find out what that's about and what he does and hear about his writing projects, which are many. Stay tuned as we talk with Ray Zimmerman. Our guest on this episode is one of those creative people in the North Georgia, Chattanooga region that I've known for several years, and I'm a little embarrassed that I just now asked him to be on the podcast. Ray Zimmerman is an established writer, and most of his writing, though not all, is about his experiences and background and knowledge based on his life and career as a naturalist. In fact, it's in his email address. So that is where we will start. Welcome to the podcast, Ray.
Thank you for inviting me.
So, what is a naturalist?
All right. I actually looked that up in a dictionary after I got the idea that you might want to know that. And it said something about a person who is an expert in or student of natural history. That's a phrase you don't hear often. And when you do hear it, it's usually associated with museums, like the American Museum of Natural History. Mm-hmm. So I don't really like that definition so well. I call myself a person who pays attention to the natural world. And I think most people I know who use the title naturalist would say the same. And that can usually include recording your observations, in my case, by journaling. It can also mean photography and drawing, and even in some cases, data collection. And I do all of those things to some extent, but the journal is my primary method of recording. So there are literary naturalists who write about their observations. Mm-hmm. Barry Lopez was an example, and Janice Ray certainly is a literary naturalist. And there are interpretive naturalists who tell stories about the natural world. You think of park rangers when you hear that. And that's one direction that can take. But there are naturalists who tell stories in private organizations, in companies, and just in the world in general. It may be a lifestyle in that case. And there are scientific naturalists that do a lot of data collection. I don't do much of that. I use an app on my phone called the iNaturalist app, though, in which I take photographs of flowers or insects, butterflies, even birds in some cases, and it helps me identify them if I don't already know what they are. And those observations are verified by experts. Once they're verified, they go into a database that can be used by researchers. So I like the iNaturalist app, but it's not my primary focus. I do some volunteer work for the Chattanooga Audubon Society, and they have a Tennessee naturalist program there. They're one chapter of a statewide organization that trains people who want to do volunteer naturalist work in parks or in private organizations. So that's another dimension that can all take, but it all amounts to paying attention to the natural. Right now,
I like that. I like that. Yeah.
I think that's a good start. Mm-hmm. Right now, I'm taking an online course with Janice Ray, a nature writer, through her Substack publication. Journey in Place is the name of the course. Mm-hmm. The Substack is called Trackless Wild. And she encourages people to pick one spot and return to that spot weekly to do the exercises and assignments for the class. If you sit in one place long enough, something's going to happen. Barry Lopez was a big advocate of that also. Find a place where something's likely to happen and just sit and watch. Stop moving around.
Okay. Boy, that was a great answer. I learned so much on that one. So, and we're going to come back to your the class you're taking because that's an area I'm very interested in. And the idea of going to one place and sitting there, that is fascinating. Mm-hmm. Okay, so that's what a naturalist is. How did you become one of these?
Okay. I can't remember ever wanting to be anything else. You know, when I was a kid, way back in the 1950s, there were a couple of television programs that were real popular. Wild Kingdom was one.
Yeah.
And there were a lot of nature specials through the wonderful world of Disney.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And I remember watching that and saying, that's what I want to do. So I was early on convinced. And of course, I grew up, I spent my childhood years on a 1-acre plot of land. Our house, we had a 1 acre with a small orchard and a large garden that fed us through the summer. And in the fall, we preserved food for the winter. A lot of our winter vegetables came from mason jars. Apple pies were made from apples that had been preserved in mason jars. And it was almost a small cottage industry to feed us. And I think that's very important. That gets into my concern with conservation. And one of the main concerns I have is that I see small farms and family farms disappearing. Mm-hmm. A lot of that is motivated by agribusiness. And also, there was a big proponent of agribusiness that served as Secretary of Agriculture at one time. His name was Earl Butts. And he created the motto for this trend. And the motto was, get big or get out. The problem with big organizations like that is that if something causes one to fail, it's a big failure. Family farms and farming families, though, have largely been a target of destruction by business and government. And it's a sad thing to see happen. The good news is we're starting to see some of that come back with locally based food sourcing, mm-hmm. farmers markets. And I think if anything is going to stave off this pending food crisis we keep hearing about, that may be the thing. You know, the author Wendell Berry was a big advocate, growing as much of your own food as you can. And he talks about that a lot in his large book of essays, The World Ending Fire. And he just put a bunch of his essays together. He's almost certainly near the end of his career at this point, at 90 years of age. But he put all of those into one book, The World Ending Fire. That's a provocative title.
Yeah.
Okay. Conservation centers on that, but there are other issues, but that's a big.
Okay. Now, it's interesting that you bring up the small farm issue because my last podcast was of a couple who are professional musicians and teachers. One of them is a professor and they're married and they started a small farm. It's called the Hissing Possum Farm. And they do organic gardening, although they don't use that. They don't have the certification technically for it, but they sell and they don't have a huge plot of land. It's in Tunnel Hill, but what they pointed out was that because they do everything by hand and there's no real machinery involved, they're able to get a much bigger yield than what a machinery. Yep. And I learned so much from that particular podcast. And I work with them there in my department, but we've never really sat and talked about their farming, and which is what I wanted to do. And I'm also going to the Rabbit Valley Farmers Market. So I'm kind of getting a theme this summer, and I have a garden myself, although I'm having a little trouble with but I'm working on it. But this idea keeps coming up in my life right now. And I've met a lot of folks at the Rabbit Valley Market that are local farmers who are there and selling their produce. So I like this idea that people are, getting back to that kind of thing. So going back to the question, you said you've always wanted to do this, kind of paying attention to nature. And yes, I remember the Wild Kingdom. I used to watch it every week. Although I always thought it was funny that it was by sponsored by the Mutual of Omaha, and they'd always have a commercial where they'd say, "The tiger takes care of her children, and you need to take care of your children with insurance."
Yeah,
they would always say that in the commercials. But
the two gentlemen in that series were extremely busy. I mean, that was not their primary job.
One of them was a zookeeper or something, wasn't he?
Marlon Perkins was director of the St. Louis Zoo.
Okay.
And Jim Fowler, who's most people don't even know his last name, he's just Jim, was a professional herpetologist who's a snake expert.
Yeah.
And he helped pioneer Animal Planet Network later.
Oh, okay. So, as a child, you were attracted to this, and as you got into adulthood, what path did you take?
I worked a lot of short-term jobs as a teacher in not in schools, but in educational facilities that provided some general public programming, but also a lot of school field trip programs.
Okay.
Eventually, I was a park ranger for a while.
Oh.
Both at Assateague Island National Seashore at one time, and then for the state of Massachusetts for a while.
Oh, so are you native of Chattanooga?
No, I was born in Canton, Ohio.
Oh my goodness. Okay.
Just outside of, just not far from Pittsburgh, which is a big industrial center. Okay.
Right. Yes. Okay. I did not know that. So, that's interesting. I'm from Maryland, so I'm familiar with Assateague and in Massachusetts. So you have spent a good bit of time outside of this area then.
Yes, I moved here in 1990.
Okay.
Which means I've been here more than 30 years, and that's longer than I've lived in any one place.
Okay.
Including my hometown.
Yeah. All right. What brought you to this area?
There was an organization called the Chattanooga Nature Center. I saw an ad for a job there, and it was, I just finished 1 year at Land Between the Lakes up near Clarksville.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And they gave me a very strong recommendation and got me hired here. So I worked for them for 11 years.
Oh, okay.
And they since have been folded into an organization called Reflection Riding.
Yes.
Which I'm a member. I enjoy going there to hike.
Mm-hmm.
But
they used to have plant sales there.
Yeah, they still do.
Do they? Okay.
You were talking about gardening. I had to do container gardening, and I put it on a table. Put the containers on a table because we have a neighborhood woodchuck that takes good care of any gardens people. He harvests.
Yeah, he harvests for you without sharing, huh?
Yeah.
Okay. So you have been in places. Have you spent much time out west, or are you mostly east of the Mississippi?
No, I've worked a short time in Kansas, Paola, Kansas, just outside of Kansas City, Kansas, at a place called Big Prairie, and it was a prairie, and prairie plants were just beautiful. And the thing I've learned from that is that there is beauty in any natural area you explore. I did a graduate degree at Northern Illinois University. And Illinois is nicknamed the Prairie State.
Mm-hmm.
So I took one field botany class where we were seeing coneflowers, sunflowers, prairie gentians, all plants that you would expect to see further west. But that's as far west as I got.
Okay.
No time in Colorado, Arizona, any of those, aside from some brief visits.
Mm-hmm. Well, do you think that, going back to the finding the one place, maybe if you were out in a whole lot of different kinds of places like the desert or the Rockies, it might be a little too diverse or too spread you too thin.
It takes a special person to do that.
Mm-hmm.
The literary naturalist Barry Lopez was a world traveler. He spent time on all 7 continents and wrote extensively about them, but he started out in the Arctic. And he said, when you go to a new place, the first thing to do is find a place to sit down and observe.
Mm-hmm.
Watch what passes by. He also was a strong advocate of learning from indigenous people. He wrote about some of the failed European polar expeditions. He said that these guys would have survived if they had abandoned cloth tents and traditional European gear and learned how the Inuit people built shelters to get through the winter and how they survived in their environment. But their egos were too big for that.
Mm-hmm.
And he talks a lot about European exploration of the Americas being focused more on carrying home a lot of wealth than on learning what could be learned from the area.
Mm-hmm.
He also talked about one time he spent some time in Australia and he asked a native guide, and the native guide said, sit and observe. And he also said, don't look in that direction because that's a sacred space and you don't need to intrude. And he respected that. So he was very big on that. Also, reading what's been written already about the areas you're investigating, I think is pretty important. You may conclude that the author was wrong,
Mm-hmm.
but more likely you'll find out that they pointed you in the right direction. Think of, a local example would be called Look Out, the Story of a Mountain.
Mm-hmm.
The author of that was Robert Sparks Walker.
Mm-hmm.
A whole chapter on waterfalls and springs of Lookout Mountain. He introduced them with a poem. He was a poet, and then gave a description. So if you're going to explore Lookout Mountain, reading that book might be a good place to start. You probably have to go to the local history department of the Chattanooga Public Library to see a copy because it's been out of print for several years.
Mm-hmm.
And then there were others. There was, what was her name up on Signal Mountain? Emma Bell Miles wrote a book called Our Southern Birds. I haven't read all of that, but it's well worth a read.
Yeah. Well, I'm interested since you mentioned the places where you spent some time, and then you spent the greatest amount of time, I suppose, in this area. How do you compare that? I mean, maybe compare is a bad word, but how do they, what do you see as sort of a difference of the experience or similarities, and differences between the regions,
There are similarities and there are differences.
Yeah.
I spent most of a year living on Cape Cod,
mm-hmm.
which is an interesting place because it's all sand. It's a terminal moraine, which means a glacier stopped there and anything that was being pushed in front of the glacier became Cape Cod. Sand dunes everywhere. some rocks, but those have been carried there by the glacier also. But the shape of the Cape Cod tends to trap bird migrations. And we have migrations here. We've got sandhill cranes that come down every winter, but Cape Cod would have other birds on migration, shorebirds, sea ducks, and because the Cape looks like an arm.
Right.
I know your listeners can't see this, but from the shoulder, it juts eastward into the ocean and then turns north. And then at the wrist, turns back west. So a bird that's following the coast encounters that landmass, and then they fly eastward along the top of the Cape, the northern shore, and then they fly northward, still following the landmass, and then turn westward, still following the landmass. And then they're back at the coast, and they keep circling. They rest here, there. They hunt in the salt marshes and feed up, but they keep circling until one of them flies high enough to see the ocean on the other side, and then they all cross.
Okay.
So that's a different kind of migration.
Yeah.
We have birds that migrate through here. A lot of ducks, sandhill cranes,
geese.
geese.
I see a lot of geese.
At Assateague Island was the snow geese. They're white.
Oh, wow.
They stop at the south end of the island in the Chincoteague National Wildlife Refuge. Before they get there, they stop up in Delaware at a place called Palm Bay Hook. And I went up to see them, and it was like someone had split open a giant pillowcase and just dumped white feathers all over the bay. There were thousands.
Wow.
So there's a similarity, but the patterns may be different. Of course, we have lots of land, plants, and animals, lots of wildflowers. In a coastal area, the beaches are pretty sterile. Not much lives on the beach. There are a couple of species of birds that nest out there. But the salt marshes on the opposite side will be full of life. Crabs, early growth stages of lobsters, small fish, they're all going to mature in that protected area and then move out. Here we have some freshwater marshes, and they are significant and seem to be disappearing, but they're important also in a different way. But, you don't see commercial fishing much compared to, say, Cape Cod, where they had a large community of Portuguese fishermen whose ancestors had come there, and there was a whole fleet of wooden fishing boats. I missed the blessing of the fleet because it takes place in summer, but I understand that when they do that, the bishop comes down from Boston, and the Portuguese sailors carry the statue of their patron saint, which is St. Peter, because he was a fisherman,
Yes.
out to the pier to stand beside the bishop. And each boat sails by and he sprinkles it with holy. So that's a major, that at least was, I don't know what the state of it is today, but it was a major source of livelihood for people there.
Yeah.
Here we have people who live from forestry sources.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, and speaking of the migration of the birds, which is always so interesting to watch in the fall and the spring. You do a lot of recognition and writing about the sandhill cranes, though not everyone is as familiar about that as maybe they should be, because it's a big deal in Upper Hamilton County up there. So talk a little bit about the sandhill cranes.
Yeah, well, aside from being a boon to tourism for Birchwood and Meigs County, they are a very obvious presence. They're a vocal presence. The thing that first impressed me was how loud they are.
Oh, really?
Those rattling calls from a distance That's before you get to the refuge. The bright red heads make them really striking. They're handsome birds. Although one time when I posted a picture online, some artificial intelligence program labeled it as an ostrich. But that tells you how large they are.
Wow. Yeah. Okay.
They're almost as large as me. And when they want to leave a place, they flap their wings and fly away. But they spend the summer nesting in Wisconsin and Michigan, come down through Indiana. There's a park in northern Indiana where they stop, and that's a staging area. They kind of rest and wait for everyone to catch up and then come down here. And then some of them spend the winter here, and some go on down to Okefenokee National Wildlife Refuge or to the Gulf Coast.
Yeah.
But they like cornfields.
Oh.
Their beak is almost like a scythe, and they can harvest the residual corn after a mowing.
Okay.
And they do eat small rodents and reptiles, but corn is a staple. And if it comes to the planted corn at Hiawassee Refuge, that they started coming there, and that was originally planted to attract geese for the goose hunters. But when the cranes started using it, the Wildlife Resources Agency capitalized on that, and they had a festival. That festival was actually started, though, by a citizen named Ken Dubke. He was the district ranger at Point Park. Ken was credited with a lot of things. He's an example to any naturalist in the area. He was involved in the Crane Festival, the restoration of osprey, the restoration of peregrine falcons, the preservation of Amicola Marsh. He's now 93. I spent most of a morning with him a while back and recorded the conversation. He permitted that recording with the provision that I not release it while he's still alive. So I'm hanging on to it. And just in case, I have lodged a copy with an organization that will hold it until it can be released if anything happens to me. So I thought it was important enough to have a backup.
Yeah. That's fascinating. I was going to ask you then about what was it about that area that got the sandhill cranes there, but that you got into that about the corn and everything.
There are two crane species in North America, sandhill and whooping.
Yeah.
The whooping are on the verge of extinction. We occasionally get one at Hiawassee. More often, they show up at Wheeler National Wildlife Refuge down near Scottsboro. And they get a huge in-flight of sandhill cranes as well. And they have a crane festival, too.
Oh.
And then in the Midwest, the big location is the Platte River out in Nebraska, where we get 25,000 greater sandhill cranes. They get a flock of 100,000. That's a mixed flock of greater and lesser sandhill cranes. The lesser are mostly distinguished by size.
Okay.
And they're just two different subspecies. California had sandhill cranes, and they winter there and nest in Alaska and Siberia. Some of them actually cross the Bering Strait. There's the birds of heaven. Peter Matheson calls them the birds from the east, because in Siberia, they're coming from the east to get to Siberia. They consider us in the east.
Okay, yeah.
California is east to them.
Okay. So I know that not all of your writing, but the majority of your writing, and I should say at this point that Ray and I are in two organizations that are writers groups. One is the Chattanooga Writers Guild, and he's been in that for longer than I have. And the other is a writers group that meets in North Georgia. And so really, I think almost all of the writing that I've read of yours in the group has been about nature or about people who have supported nature and natural phenomenon and that kind of thing. When did you start writing in a way that you were, getting it out in public?
1988.
Okay.
I'd been at Assateague Island for 6 months, and I had a lull before I went to my next job, which started in January. And I wrote an article about the wild ponies of Assateague Island.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And it's famous for the wild ponies. And interestingly, I've seen them standing in the surf because sea breezes keep the land insect free. When you get a land breeze coming off the salt marsh, there are overloads of mosquitoes and biting flies. And the way the wild ponies get away from those is they wade out into the surf.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I wrote an article and I sent it to a little known newspaper, but it was nationally distributed at the time, called Cappers. Very similar to, anyhow, it was a lot of folklore and country living and so forth, but they decided they liked my article and my photograph of a wild pony and published it.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been publishing since then.
Right. Yeah, you're pretty.
In the 90s, I published a lot in a professional journal called the Journal of Interpretation, and that's a organization. It's the Journal of the National Association for Interpretation, which is made up of naturalists and park rangers. And I working at the Chattanooga Nature Center. I wrote a lot about what was going on there.
Okay, very good. One thing we've touched upon, and this is kind of going back to my roots in my most recent book. Have you written much about Appalachia, Southern Appalachia?
A bit. It's increasing. Mm-hmm. And I'll read, when we get to the reading section, I'll read a poem that I consider Appalachian. It was published in a Journal of Appalachian Literature.
Okay.
But it's interesting you say Southern Appalachia, because locally that seems to be synonymous with Appalachia.
Yeah. No, not to me, but.
Interestingly, my mother grew up in a coal mining community. Her dad was a coal miner for a while, and that was not in that was in Pennsylvania.
Right.
And they moved to Canton, Ohio, and became factory workers. He and some of his children, including my mother, worked in factories there. She was a factory worker during World War II before she met my dad. But her storytelling contributed to my writing in a way that I can't really define, but it's there.
Okay.
So she was Northern Apple.
Yeah. Yeah, by Southern, I mean Virginia and down through here, pretty much. I mean, I guess you could count parts of West Virginia too, but yeah. So
if you look at the Appalachian Regional Commission's
right
map, they have a great map. The only state that falls entirely in Appalachia is West Virginia.
Mm-hmm.
And there are parts of western parts of Virginia and Maryland, and a good chunk of eastern Kentucky,
and eastern
Tennessee, and it continues north into southeastern Ohio, western, almost all of Pennsylvania, and the southernmost tier of New York.
Mm-hmm.
And then on this end, it includes northwest South Carolina, and North Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a huge area.
You don't think of Mississippi very much as Appalachia, though. But
there are a lot of people who don't think of themselves as Appalachian, who fall within that area.
Yeah.
And then there are large communities of people who consider themselves Appalachian and come from the area that live in places in 3 cities I can think of: Louisville, Cincinnati, and Chicago.
Right. Mm-hmm.
But that culture is still alive in those people.
Mm-hmm. The diaspora kind of thing.
Yeah.
So one thing I was also going to ask about is you have a website and you also have a Substack. And for those who don't know about Substack, myself being one of them, I'm just, what's the deal with Substack?
Substack is an innovation in publishing that allows the author to deal directly with the consumer. It's sort of like self-publishing, but self-publishing uses a publishing house nonetheless, whether they use Ingram or Kindle Direct Publishing or some small company. And Substack is an intermediary for the writers in this case.
Okay.
There are paid subscribers and unpaid subscribers. The majority of mine are unpaid. I think mainly because I don't do a lot that's just for the paid subscribers. Mm-hmm. And I've done more of that lately, but I have a small subscriber base there. The interesting thing to me is, although there's some anonymity to it, the writer owns the mailing list. You can download it at any time, use it for promotions. I suspect if you do that a lot, you will lose your subscriber base.
Right,
but,
yeah.
But a few things to keep them connected.
Mm-hmm.
So I make a small amount of money from it. I have just under 100 subscribers, and there are Substack authors that have thousands.
Mm-hmm.
Most of those are also authors in other sense. They've published books commercially. But it is interesting. I saw a video the other day by a writer who had serialized 2 novels on Substack.
Mm-hmm.
He said she made much more money serializing her novels than she would ever have made publishing the bound.
Yeah. I think that's an interesting kind of a thing. And along that line, yesterday, I think because of something you sent out, I went to Janice Ray's and I asked for her to be on the podcast, and I hope maybe someday I will get her, but she's so busy. And I just
promoting a new book right now.
Oh, another one, a new one.
Yeah, it's a book about nature writing.
Okay. Yeah. Because she had one that came out last year about the children in
Fannin
County. Yeah. Which
that was still published, interesting.
Yes. She did well with it, though. I mean, she was here on campus and she talked about how many she had sold. And it was much more successful. Yeah, she has sold.
And she's sold of her commercially published book.
Right. Which is sad to me or weird because, maybe Ecology of Cracker Childhood, she probably did the best with, but it is the most amazing book. I mean, I used to have copies and I think I gave them all away to people because it is it's not just great in the nature part of it, which is one part, but her family, her experience, her parents, that's so touching. It's so well done. And so I always say that's just, to me, that's one of the best memoirs that I think I've ever read, especially about the South. Because so many people, when they write memoirs about the South, they just, or Appalachia, it's all the, drug addicts and just, all the bad stuff. And her stuff isn't about the bad stuff. It's just about reality. So.
Well, it's either that or it's how great grandpa hung them.
Yeah. So it's interesting you're taking her class, and I checked out her Substack. I don't know if I'm going to subscribe to it because I'm trying to save money. in general in life here. But I'm glad to know she's got another book coming, so I'll look into that. Interesting. So thank you.
There are three others that I would recommend.
Mm-hmm.
Misty Little, if you're interested in the natural world text.
Okay.
But she's an excellent writer. Brian Pfeiffer has one called Chasing Nature, and Bill Davidson, Easy by Nature.
Okay.
But there are a plethora of nature writers on Substack.
Yeah.
And I'm one of a crowd.
Yeah. So so that's it's, even though a lot of people don't know about Substack, it's a huge thing. So,
yeah.
Okay. Well, you mentioned that you had a poem. So, let's hear your poem, Appalachia.
Okay. I'm going to read one that is not a nature poem.
Okay.
This was published in the Tennessee Voices Anthology from the Poetry Society of Tennessee. Villanelle for the didgeridoo. We all should try the didgeridoo. With practice, I'm sure I could learn how to play. It would make me happy. How about you? With that honking noise, the birds all flew. The upstairs neighbors have moved away. We all should try the didgeridoo. Uninvited guests are suddenly few. Those who arrived have promised to pray. It would make me happy. How about you? New friends now say they love it for true. They sit and listen with never a fray. We all should try the didgeridoo. With time, my musical repertoire grew. I charmed a small dog, the neighborhood stray. It would make me happy. How about you? Broken, I quickly repaired it with glue. I'd love to say more, but I cannot stay. We all should try the didgeridoo. It would make me happy. How about you?
All right. So what's a didgeridoo?
It's an Australian instrument played by Aboriginal people.
Okay. That's what, yeah.
And it does sound like a honking noise until you get used to it. It's actually quite beautiful. But a friend of mine who is a music teacher said that playing the didgeridoo was like playing a tuba and a trumpet. A tuba and a kazoo at the same time. So is that okay? I mean, is that all you want to hear? Or do you want?
No, you said you had one about Appalachia.
Family. One grandma died young. At age 12, Mama became her nurse. She helped the lady of the house to the porch so she could sew in the sun. Her father called her our little nurse. Each morning, she packed her daddy's lunch, an unasked question on her lips, the day he dropped a pistol into the lunchbox. The miners were on strike. He walked the picket line weary of company goons. Don't let anyone in the house. Those company men are tricky. He once said that a man walked up to him in the mine, conversed for a few minutes, and faded away into the wall. Another grandma succumbed to madness when her husband abandoned her with all those kids. The orphanage kindly welcomed Papa. 2 maiden aunts took him in so he could go to high school. Now I have gone and done it. I have dropped my guard and wonder how much I should let you see through my disguise. Perhaps I will let in just a little more light. We may have been poor, but we owned land. The garden fed us all summer. Mason jars of beans, tomatoes, and corn fed us most of the winter, supplemented with rabbit and pheasant from Dad's game pouch. Trips to the store were occasional for grits, coffee, sugar, and bacon. Mama's hens provided eggs until the zoning commission said that they had to go. Some nights I slept in my tent. Daytime I read in its shade, my companion a hound dog, barely grown from a pup. I named her Babe after Paul Bunyan's Blue Ox. I read every story I could about that legend of a man. Paul Bunyan's frying pan was so big, 2 lumberjacks skated across its surface with slabs of bacon strapped to their feet. They greased the pan for the dozens of eggs he cooked and ate for breakfast each morning. When the Blue Ox Babe stopped for a drink, the round river ran dry. Before I left fundamentalism behind, they dunked me in the water 3 times. Once for the Father, once for the Son, once for the Holy Ghost. I emerged primarily unchanged. I guess changes came later, but not right there.
Yeah. Okay, was this a church that would baptize people 3 times? That's a new one.
They immersed 3 times.
Oh,
in baptism.
Okay.
And the minister put his handkerchief over my nose and mouth and took me once, and then a second time, and then a third time. And I tried to breathe in between times.
Yes. Okay. Well, I look forward to reading more of your material from the group, and I want to encourage everyone to check out Ray's website, which is rayzimmerman.com, right? Is that correct?
RayZimmermanAuthor.com.
Yeah, that's what it is.
And I can't get away without mentioning that it looks like I will have a book come out in November.
Oh, wonderful. And it is about your past writings. It's a collection of your past writings mostly, right?
This one will be a poetry collection.
Oh, okay.
I am working on prose collections, 2 or 3 different ones. I'd probably finish them sooner if I'd settle down and focus on one at a time.
Yeah, I'm having that trouble too. I got too much going on. All right. Well, thank you for being on the podcast today, Ray. We've been speaking with Ray Zimmerman, who lives in the Chattanooga area, and he is a naturalist and a writer. And he's been regaling us with stories about nature and his growing up and his career observing nature. Thanks for being here, Ray.
Thank you.
All right. See you all next time. Bye-bye.